Ferries of the Cobequid Bay. Today's talk is about the ferries that plied the turbulent waters of the Minas Basin and the mouth of the Shubenacadie River. By 2005, I had been working on exhibits with various people at the Historium for nearly 20 years. I had learned a lot about Colchester history, but one thing I knew nothing about was the story of these ferries. It was a local story the Colchester Historical Society had not tackled. Their archives yielded a lot of information, but interviews with many people were vital to getting the full story. In particular, Roy Rhino of Maitland and Donelda Nelson of Great Village provided fascinating details in many of the photos that follow. I felt honored to spend time with these people. Once we began to collect the photos and stories for the exhibit, it seemed obvious it should all be preserved in a book in addition to the display. This photograph, taken from the Colchester side, shows the mouth of the Shubenacadie River with Maitland to the left and the Cobequid Bay in the distance. The communities of Maitland and Black Rock face one another across a very difficult stretch of water, a little more than a mile distant. The communities on the north shore of the bay, Little Dyke, Glenholm, and Spencer's Point, are 6 or 7 miles across the bay from Maitland. Land travel in the early days was usually on horseback over rough trails, and our many lakes and rivers were a barrier. Bridges, fords, ferries were all a very necessary reality to cross these bodies of water in order to get from point A to point B. The diary of Reverend James McGregor, 1759 to 1850, gives an interesting account of a trip from Halifax to Truro, which included a very basic ferry ride. McGregor came to Nova Scotia to serve as a Gaelic-speaking Presbyterian minister in Pictou in July 1786. On arrival in Halifax, McGregor hired a horse and, accompanied by a farmer from Truro, set out for Pictou. And I quote, "The greatest part of the road was both difficult and dangerous, on account of the many swamps full of roots and logs. Toward evening we came to the river Stewiacke, where there was a considerable clearing on the side of the river. The soil was very fertile." I think that was approximately where the Mastodon Ridge has been more recently located, behind what was Farmer Clem's. McGregor continued, "Seeing neither boat nor bridge, I thought only of swimming across it, but my companion showed me a trough on the edge of the river on the other side, and told me it was one of the canoes of Nova Scotia, and that it would carry us over in safety. Perceiving a man mowing hay at some distance, my fellow traveler called aloud to him. He understood we wanted a passage, at once threw aside his scythe, and on reaching the river, turned the canoe on its side to empty it of some water, and quickly paddled it over to us. He directed us to take the saddles off our horses, helped us to drive them into the river to swim across. Putting my saddle in the bottom of the canoe, he desired me to sit down upon it. I did so, and he ferried me across quickly and safely, and afterwards my companion in the same manner. The man was dressed in homemade check or woolen shirt and striped trousers, without a hat, handkerchief, or stocking." McGregor goes on to say they were taken to the man's house, where the horses were put to pasture, and they supped on bread, fish, and tea. And he began to conclude there were no other eatables in Nova Scotia. Okay, let's look at the particular ferry routes that crisscrossed the Cobequid Bay and the communities they served. In early documents, Maitland was referred to by several names: Douglas, Beaver River Settlement, and Mouth of the River. The name Douglas continued to be used for a wider district and appears in government documents as late as 1850. Today, Maitland is a lovely village with charming streets and a wonderful architecture left from another age. It was once a thriving community with a busy port. Shipbuilding and trade in timber and gypsum with the United States, the West Indies, and further ports brought great prosperity to the area. In the period of peak production, 28 shipyards operated in the Maitland area, employing about 1,000 men during the summer months. In 1872-74, the largest wooden-hulled ship ever built in Canada, the W.D. Lawrence, was launched there. Hundreds of additional men were employed in other industries during boom times. In her History of Maitland, Abby Lawrence, granddaughter of the great shipbuilder W.D. Lawrence, writes, "The peak of shipbuilding in Maitland was 1875, when 15 vessels were built or registered that year, all good-sized barks." And the Colchester side. Along the north shore of the Cobequid Bay, beginning at the Shubenacadie River, were the settlements of Londonderry Township. Several of these communities at one time had ferry service to Maitland. Today, these are, for the most part, quiet communities strung out along Highway Number 2. Homes and businesses remain, but the hustle and bustle of the 19th century are gone. The Cobequid Mountains are inland from these communities, and at intervals, rivers flow down from these forested hills to the bay. At the mouths of these rivers, the tide flows in twice a day, filling the rivers inland. Lower Debert, Folly Village, Little Dyke, Great Village, and Spencer's Point all had wharves and shipbuilding industries located on the banks of the rivers. General stores and businesses thrived. Community folklore in this area tells of people in the past crossing the bay on foot or with a horse and wagon at low tide, a shocking prospect to me. Let's look at Black Rock, Old Barns, and Clifton. Across the Shubenacadie River from Maitland was the Truro Township. It extended as far as the Salmon River and included communities known today as Black Rock, Clifton, Old Barns, Lower Truro, Truro Heights, and Truro. The Black Rock Farm in Clifton at the mouth of the Shubenacadie River got its name because of the black or dark-colored rock on the Colchester side of the river, in contrast to the light-colored cliffs on the Hants or Maitland side. We are indebted to Harry Nelson, an educator and historian, for much of the information about the ferries that operated across the Shubenacadie. This property was purchased by Samuel Nelson in 1854 and remained in that family for over 120 years. The land was originally granted to William Nesbitt in 1765 and had 2 non-resident owners prior to 1774 when Samuel Creelman moved his family from Amherst. Harry Nelson wrote, "Presumably the ferry business went with the ownership of the farm where the landing place was located." Another family member, Eda Nelson, wrote a paper for the Colchester Historical Society in 1956. Cut off by lack of roads through the woods from our own townships, settlers on both sides of the river traveled by water and became almost one community. This certainly implies the need for a regular ferry service to cross the 1.5 miles of water. Today, Black Rock, Clifton, and Old Barns are prosperous farming communities that give no hint of the industries that once flourished here, employing many. During the 19th century, mines, lumbering, shipbuilding, and fishing provided employment in this area and around Cobequid Bay. Before the coming of the railway, much of the freight required for the Truro Township was shipped to Maitland and brought further by land or by smaller vessel. Potatoes, lumber, lime, and plaster were all produced locally and shipped abroad. A ledger for the Black Rock Ferry operation in the 1830s contains an undated note concerning the shipment of 97.5 tons of plaster being shipped. Harry Nelson wrote, "The boom days of the ferry service corresponded with Maitland's shipbuilding and sailing eras when there was considerable traffic between Truro and Maitland." How did the earliest ferries in the Cobequid Bay operate? They would have relied on oars or sails, likely both, depending on the tide and the weather conditions. Mildred Burroughs, in her book, The History of Clifton and Old Barns, quotes an 1857 petition by Job Dart for a ferry over the Shubenacadie River, remembering that this is 70 years since Reverend McGregor had a farmer with a canoe ferry him across the Stewiacke River. Job Dart's petition states the need for a ferry very clearly. Maitland is the principal port of shipping from Shubenacadie and Truro to the United States. All the traveling from Truro to the county of Hants is done by Black Rock Ferry, besides the conveyance of passengers to and from the county of Colchester. Clearly, a ferry is operating by 1857. This request to the Nova Scotia House of Assembly also provides the earliest description we have of a ferry in this area. Dart says he must keep 2 boats, one for the conveyance of passengers, another called a horse boat for the conveyance of carriages, etc., across the river. And since his residence is at the Black Rock Ferry, his neighbors and the traveling public can testify he has been attentive and obligingly accommodating to the ferry in ferrying them over. According to Hattie Densmore in his 1963 article in the Halifax Chronicle Herald about the Maitland Black Rock ferries. The rowboat was anchored in the middle of a stream with 2 lines, one running to each bank and easily accessible at low tide. The passenger walked down to the edge. The operator pulled the boat in, rowed or sculled across, and delivered his load on Black Rock. Then he might pick up any load that might be there to come to Maitland, and came right back. If passengers consisted of a horse and vehicle, the vehicle was put on the gunwales of the boat, and a line running from the boat towed or swam the horse across. If a horse balked at this process, his driver had to swim across on the back of the horse, without the assistance of the boat, although it took the vehicle. When the vehicle was a buggy, it went astride the boat, with the 2 wheels dangled in the water. A very precarious sounding situation to our modern ears. As early as 1783, the Provincial Parliament of Nova Scotia passed an act for establishing and regulating ferries. It begins, whereas the establishment of ferries in many parts of this province is of great utility and renders the communication of several places more easily and expeditious. Given the state of the roads at that time, anything that improved travel was recognized as being of great benefit. The act stated that justices in each county could establish and regulate such ferries over rivers, bays, or creeks within their respective counties, as may be by them thought necessary. The earliest document found relating to this area is from the session of 1819, naming Samuel Forbes to run the ferry. A similar document from 1826 renews the license. Both the 1819 and the 1826 licenses refer to a free license being issued to the ferryman. Even at this early date, permission was required to sell liquor, a privilege for which there was usually a fee. Sometimes this fee was waived if the applicant was providing a service to the public, ferrying in this case. The 1819 regulations set down rates to be charged for the 2 seasons, April 1st to December 1st and December 1st to April 1st, and stressed the responsibility of the ferryman to cross the river with safety at all times when the tide will answer or when the river may be passable. In 1826, it states, the ferryman must keep a good and sufficient boat and ready attendance at all times, when possible, for which he is to receive a free license, complying with the laws and regulations for public houses. If not, the official ferryman would be subject to a fine, not exceeding 40 shillings. Let's look at the ledgers. Fortunately, detailed record books remain for some periods of the operation of the Black Rock-based ferries. From their pages emerges a picture of bustling communities with the constant comings and goings of local folks, people traveling for both business and pleasure. And there we see the list of the ferries that were available. A study of the ledgers revealed much about the day-to-day operation of the businesses, but also yielded other information. For example, the expenses associated with building the Black Rock home, 1886 to 93, the costs of construction of the vessels Liberty Hall and Ethel May. A member of the Forbes family owned the Black Rock property from 1798, although at times the ferry was operated by other people. In 1819, a Forbes received a tavern license. His day book, beginning on August 25, 1821, also indicates that he offered meals, lodging, and various items for sale. Samuel Forbes also ran a livery stable, renting horses. Entries read, "To horse to Truro, 7 shillings 6 pence. To Truro 3 days, 15 shillings. One March entry reads, "Horse and sleigh to Truro, 7 shillings 6 pence. Frequent charges also appear relating to livestock, horsekeeping, horse pasturing. Now to the ferries themselves. A description of low-water ferries is provided to us by Elizabeth Frame, a teacher and writer from Shubenacadie, in her Descriptive Sketches of Nova Scotia, published in 1864. Elizabeth describes a ferry ride between Spencer's Point, which had no wharf at that time, and Selma, a busy port near Maitland. It paints a clear picture of a trip across the bay when no wharf was available on the Colchester side. Somehow traffic had to cross the mud flats at low tide to access the channel of water remaining, a difficult and slippery task, especially for wheeled vehicles and livestock. The low-water ferry narrative that follows helps us to understand the effort involved. The very gently advancing waves come steadily near and nearer to the shore. A strong current fills the creek. 4 stalwart men drag the boat to the bank. Passengers and rowers step up. A gentle shove, and she slides through the soft ooze into the water. The sail is shook out and filled with a gentle breeze, which freshens as we recede from the shore. The tide is very smooth. We cross the Cobequid Bay, here about 6 miles broad, and are landed alongside of the wharf at Selma in less than an hour. Here we are met by the busy and active A. McDougall, or the captain, as the boatmen call him, who is engaged in superintending the loading of a large bark with plaster, bound for Richmond, Virginia, while 2 others are lying near the wharf to await their turn to load. Reading this helps one to understand the operation of the low-water ferry and clarifies why ferry operations would have been based at the mouths of rivers, particularly the mouths of the Shubenacadie, Folly, and Debert rivers, to minimize the expanse of mudflats that had to be crossed, hauling the weight of a boat over slippery surfaces. Just outside of the village of Glenholm is Little Dyke. Near here, the Folly River meets the Debert River, and they flow into the bay. Both communities were in the Londonderry Township. In 1866, a petition was submitted to Colchester County to establish a ferry between Londonderry and Maitland, and I quote, "owing to the increase of traveling." The petition states, "The low-water ferry, heretofore established, being insufficient for the wants of the public, being only 2 days each week, and the channel changing so that for nearly 2 years it has been impracticable to convey horses and carriages. The petitioner, William Stewart of Londonderry, proposes to run a boat for passengers only every day of the week, Sunday excepted, and wind and weather permitting, from Little Dyke to Mr. Cochrane's wharf in Maitland. This being high-water ferry has many advantages over the low-water ferry at Debert." The petitioners were successful, and William Stewart was granted the right to run a ferry as requested in 1866. The extreme high and low tides of the Minas Basin and the Cobequid Bay required flat-bottomed boats that could cope with these dramatic changes in water levels. It was necessary to have vessels that could be hauled with relative ease across the mudflats at low tide. One such vessel, known as a shad boat, was used extensively along the coastline for the shad fishery which flourished here in the late 19th and early 20th century. Its construction permitted it to sit on the mud at low tide. It's believed shad boats, similar to those in this photograph, were used to carry passengers and light freight to Maitland. The regulated service, established between Little Dyke and Maitland in 1866, would have used a boat like this until regular service between these 2 locations was discontinued in 1925. The earliest photograph we have of any Black Rock Maitland ferry we located, this one of the Liberty Hall, which was launched in 1899. This, and I quote, large sailboat was equipped with an engine and a sail. There was a ramp on the stern of the boat which added to the carrying capacity and was used for loading. The following Daily News clipping from May 9, 1899 demonstrates the excitement generated by the launch of a new ship. Headline: Liberty Hall to be launched. On Thursday afternoon, about 2:30 o'clock, the keel of a new ferry boat now being built by Messrs. Elias Nelson and Isaiah McDougall at Black Rock, Clifton, will for the first time kiss the foamy waters of Fundy's turgid tides. The builders and owners of the boat will christen this addition to our marine fleet the Liberty Hall, in honor of the clubhouse that has been erected at the Rock by a number of our Truro cyclists. The Liberty Hall will be used as a ferry boat between Black Rock and Maitland, and the enterprise of Nelson and McDougall is deserving of the liberal patronage of the public. If the weather continues fine, a number of bicyclists will wheel down to the launch to see the orthodox bottle of wine broken over the bows of the Liberty Hall as she plunges into the wild waters of the Shubenacadie. No record has been found as to when this horseboat stopped serving the traveling public, but we know the Ethel May was launched in 1912. Thus, it seems some of the earliest automobiles appearing in the 1911 ferry ledgers crossed the Shubenacadie on the Liberty Hall. Surely an amazing sight. This undated postcard in this slide shows the Cochrane's Wharf at Maitland, located in the middle of the village. Let's look at more of the wharves involved. During its heyday, there were 3 main wharves along Maitland's waterfront and numerous smaller docks built for private use. The Cochrane store was located at the beginning of Ferry Lane. Today, the Cochrane store building survives as the IOF Hall, but nothing remains at the dock. The government wharf was located further along the shore, where the current government wharf is found, at the Dawson Dowell Park near the Lawrence House Museum. In an October 9, 1963 Chronicle Herald article, Hattie Dyke reported on the Liberty Hall's destination. At flood tide, the sailboat was used. It was anchored at the first ferry wharf. The road running to the wharf was then known as Cat Street, now known by the much grander name of Academy Street. This was so called because a large proportion of Maitland's feline population followed the products, taken to the ferry, and could be found on the road day and night. This captain's surname was Stewart. His home was on Cat Street, and his wife served warm meals to weary travelers. This shot shows the ferry at Black Rock during the 1920s, showing 2 Nelson-owned and operated ferries. The Eunice sits to the right, empty, and the Ethel May to the left, loaded with 2 vehicles. The location at the dock at Black Rock was chosen to take full advantage of the maximum rise and fall of the tide. The slip was particularly long to accommodate the varying heights of the tide. Harry Nelson recalled, "A small boat for passengers could operate at any time except during the first 2 hours of the incoming tide. At the mouth of the Black Rock, at the mouth of the river at Black Rock, the tide rises for 3 hours and ebbs for 9 3/4 hours. So the flood tide rushes in too swiftly for a boat propelled by sail or oars." During the 19th and early 20th centuries, ferries based in the Maitland area, both regulated and unregulated, carried traffic to Black Rock and several communities along the north shore of the Cobequid Bay, stretching from Lower Debert Beach to Spencer's Point. Early in 1815, Isaiah Smith petitioned the House of Assembly for permission to establish a stagecoach from Halifax to Windsor. The operation began with 15 horses, 2 coaches, and sleighs for winter travel. It ran once a week until May, when it began a twice-weekly schedule. In 1854, the Legislative Assembly granted Isaiah Smith £15, and I quote, to enable him to provide or build a sufficient ferry boat to run across the mouth of the Shubenacadie River between Douglas and Truro townships, and Douglas and Londonderry district, to be drawn or paid when it is certified by the court sessions that the boat has been provided and performing the service required. In 1855, the Assembly granted £10 to Mrs. E. Smith on the Hants side of the Shubenacadie, matching Job Dart's grant on the Colchester side. Mrs. Smith also received a $20 grant, and I quote, to ferry between Douglas and Londonderry. It's unknown if there was any connection between Isaiah and Mrs. E. Smith, but it seems probable they were related, perhaps husband and wife. In her book, Old Time Travel in Nova Scotia, Edith Mosier writes, Isaiah Smith, well-known stagecoach driver on the Halifax-Windsor route, operated a ferry service from Maitland to Truro and Londonderry in the mid-1800s. A man named Shaw took over the driving of Smith's coach during the owner's ferrying period. No record has been located concerning the details of Smith's ferry operation, but it may have been the low-water ferry at Debert, which ran 2 days each week and was referred to in the 1866 petition. As a result of this submission to the Colchester authorities, William Stewart of Londonderry received permission to run a ferry between Cochrane's Wharf in Maitland and Little Dyke. Let's look at the Maitland. This photo shows a vessel at the wharf in Maitland with 4 early automobiles from the 1920s on board. Unfortunately, our information about the Maitland-based ferries to Black Rock is sketchy. We know from the Nelson papers that competition to the Nelson ferries existed from 1920 to 1928. Given the name on the side of this vessel, perhaps this boat provided that service. Roy Rhino of Maitland recalled one boat, referred to as the Mackenzie and Macumber ferry, was owned by Calvin Macumber, a pilot of the ferry, and his partner Harold Mackenzie, engineer. Was this the Maitland? Perhaps it is the boat referred to in an October 9, 1963 Halifax Chronicle Herald article by Hattie Densmore. The third set of ferry boats were large motor vessels designed to handle increasing traffic. One was owned by Mr. Nelson and the other by Harold Mackenzie and O.J. O'Brien. It was operated by Mr. Mackenzie. This ferry was later sold for the gravel trade, and Nelson's continued alone for many years. They were the last to run a ferry across the Shubenacadie. Well, the times were changing in many ways. The coming of the railway, and those are the various significant dates and the things that happened. The Nova Scotia Railway began the Halifax to Truro and Windsor runs in 1858. 1872, the Intercolonial Railway was established. And most significantly for this area, the bridge over the Shubenacadie near today's Goss Bridge was built in 1901. The impact of the railway cannot be overstated. The volume of traffic and the number of passengers on the Black Rock Ferry declined dramatically after the autumn of 1901. Passenger traffic dropped from an annual high of 1,693 for 1898 to a low of 622 in 1902, a dramatic drop. At this time, the Maitland-based ferries ceased to run, and the Nelson family serviced traffic crossing the Shubenacadie in both directions until the 1920s. Freight charges essentially disappear after 1903, but a dramatic drop is evident from 1901 when the railway bridge over the Shubenacadie was built. The advent of the automobile a decade later brought new customers and revenue picked up again. The number of automobiles in Nova Scotia grew quickly after the first cars appeared for sale in 1904. That year there were 17 automobiles in the province. Transportation in Nova Scotia, like the rest of North America, was changing rapidly. In the years leading up to the start of World War I, life was speeding up in Colchester County and the rest of the province. 1907 was the first year the province of Nova Scotia issued automobile licenses. 62 were issued that year. In 1911, the first automobile traffic is recorded in the ledger for the Black Rock Ferry. By 1922, 16,000 automobiles were registered in Nova Scotia. A very eventful ferry ride happened in 1907, and we'll look at that. The Truro Weekly News, a 1960 bicentenary issue, contains an interesting story told by a senior living in Halifax. Cameron Wickwin was then 83 years old. He was the first registered chauffeur in Halifax. In 1907, the first 5-passenger touring car arrived in the city. It was built in West Toronto and sold to F.B. McCurdy. Fleming Blanchard McCurdy was a prominent banker and politician born in Clifton, Colchester County in 1875. This car was a Russell. Wickwire was employed by the railway, but in the summer he got leave to work as McCurdy's chauffeur and repairman. His recollection of a trip from Halifax to Truro by the scenic route makes it clear that the ferries across the Shubenacadie were not quite ready for automobile traffic. In early October, they left Halifax for a trip through the Annapolis Valley and Hants County, planning to reach Truro via the Shore Road. They spent one night at Mount Uniacke and another at Windsor, traveling as far as Berwick. They experienced car troubles near Walton on the third night. It was breaking day, and the roosters were crowing lustily as we gathered up our tools and equipment and prepared for the road. After a hasty breakfast at the farmhouse, we started on the road for Maitland, arriving there about 3 p.m. He, the ferryman, had to wait for the high tide. The tide was becoming high about dark, so we got the car safely aboard the ferry by means of several men with ropes who lowered it down a steep ramp and onto the boat. We crossed the river without incidents, but when we reached the shore, we found a steep bank leading to the highway. What to do? We had to engage a pair of oxen to haul the car up the steep bank. Once on the highway, we made fairly good time and reached Truro and the Learmont Hotel, where we spent the night. Having taken 4 days to complete a trip that can now be done in 4 hours, with the exception of the use of the Maitland ferry, which is now no longer in operation. Unfortunately, this article doesn't mention which ferry or operator was involved in the crossing. Most likely it was the Liberty Hall, as during this period after the arrival of the railway, the Nelson vessels served crossings in both directions. The story illustrates how difficult early automobile traffic was and how ill prepared the ferries, the wharves, and the roads for this new traffic. By 1920, most American-built cars featured left-side driving, and the rule of driving on the left or the right side varied from province to province across Canada. This could not continue as traffic and automobile travel increased. On Sunday, April 15th, 1923, at 2 in the morning, Nova Scotia changed from left to right-hand traffic for all vehicles. This brought us in line with, and I quote, the rest of the Dominion. This photo shows a related newspaper article from April 14, 1923. A campaign to remind drivers of this included "Keep to the right" signs to be displayed in the windshield of your automobile. In this photo, you can see one of the signs on the Maitland Black Rock Ferry. It's in the first in the windshield of the first car on the ferry. Some of the early official documents relating to ferries record misadventures. That's not surprising. Job Dart's 1857 petition to the Legislative Assembly requesting funds for a new boat reports the following. Last fall, he, the petitioner, met with a serious misfortune in the loss of the horseboat. She broke from her moorings and went adrift down the Bay of Fundy and was a total loss. Edna Nelson, in her 1956 paper for the Colchester Historical Society, wrote, "There was no Catholic church in the township until a church was built in Truro in 1872. Maitland had a chapel where a missionary priest officiated on his rounds, probably coming across the bay from Parsborough. The chapel stood on the bank of the river opposite Black Rock, and families from Green Oak and Clifton and shipyard workers crossed the river to these services. The story has often been told of a boat that capsized, drowning 4 persons who were returning to Clifton after Mass." None of our research has turned up any serious incidents during the period when the Nelson family operated the ferry service. In fact, a 1928 newspaper article, "There Go the Ships," reports Elias Nelson was a ferryman for 50 years and bore the proud record of never having a mishap. That is not to say that difficult situations didn't occur. In 1963, Hattie Densmore recorded the following memory. "At one point, a herd of cattle was on board, and I quote, 'A cold rain had come up from the south, and the ferry couldn't land at Black Rock. It was too rough. Eddie Nelson then shifted position, and they drifted downwind to land at the marsh bank. When they tried to upload the cattle, the ramp was pushed up by heavy seas, throwing them back onto the boat with water splashing on all sides. The wind had shifted, making it impossible to start the engine, as the boat was against the bank and the propeller would be torn off. They used poles and shoved her off the bank, enabling them eventually to start the engine. Eventually the wind shifted and they were able to land at the wharf at Black Rock. The cows, some close to calving, walked off without any trouble at all. It's not surprising that occasionally tense, if not downright dangerous moments occurred in moving cars on small vessels across such potentially turbulent waterway. This was compounded by transportation changing so rapidly in the early years of the 20th century. As the late Harry Nelson recalled, both the boat, the Ethel May, and the landings were designed for the carriage trade rather than for cars. Cars had either to back on or back off. The landing on the Black Rock side had quite a steep bank beyond the wharf, which was difficult for some early models. I remember following behind some of the wheezy ones, or the ones with poor drivers, with a chalk for the rear wheel in case of stalling. A story is passed down in the Fleming family of Truro and was told to me by the late K. Fleming Purdy. It tells of 2 sisters home for a visit from the United States, crossing with their mother on the ferry from Black Rock to Maitland. Their car began to slip backwards into the river and required several strong men to push it out of the water safely onto the boat. No doubt a chalk was placed behind the rear wheels. This photo from the Nelson collection shows an automobile and a team on board. Clearly visible are wet tire tracks coming up the ramp, so a similar incident may have taken place. It's obvious the car tires were at least temporarily in the water, and now a chalk is in place, ensuring the car does not roll backwards. Winter traffic. In the period before the coming of the railroad to Nova Scotia, travel in general during the winter was often quicker than in other seasons. The condition of appalling roads was worse during the winter months. Freezing temperatures and snow could make travel smoother in a sleigh. However, the cold, with only an oilcloth, blankets, or a buffalo robe for covering, would make for uncomfortable and chilly passengers. Various people recalling the ferry business in the first decades of the 20th century refer to a lack of winter crossings, but the Forbes, Wilson, and Nelson ledgers indicate otherwise. The wall of ice and great floes moving and shifting with the tide must have made crossing the Shubenacadie very difficult during those early days, but there were not a lot of choices. Certainly after 1900, and I quote, the ferry operated officially from May 1st until November 30th, or at least until there was a period, or at least that was the period service had to be provided. During the winter, the river is filled with floating ice cakes. Although the ice is gone before May 1st, in my earlier days, cars were not permitted to operate until May 1st on country roads. The early spring and December ferriage seems to have depended greatly on the weather and ice conditions. An interesting note about ice appears in the ledger for December 1895. That month there were 45 passengers ferried and 3 wagons. The ferry operated on 15 days and collected a total of $22.25. The following year, ice is mentioned again on December 15th, and on the 17th, a note reads clear, indicating it likely was a comment on the river conditions. After the coming of the railway in 1901, there were no January or February crossings, and fewer of them during December and March. Christmas crossings. Israel Longworth's diary for Friday, December 23rd, 1859 notes Alfred Dickey and his cousin David Douglas were driven to the Rock by Leishman Fullerton today. They go to Maitland to spend their Christmas holidays. An examination of the ledgers revealed crossings on Christmas days were not uncommon. Mail and newspapers were ferried across on that day in 1827. The following December 25th, crossings were recorded. 4 passengers in 1895, 3 in 1897, 2 passengers crossing in December of 1915. And here we see the launch of another Nelson boat, the Ethel May, in 1912. And this is the Ethel May approaching the Cochrane Dock in Maitland. And you can see the Lawrence House in the background. Lawrence Lockhart, the son of W.D. Lawrence, was one of the builders of the Ethel May. And here you see the account, an actual image of the account in the ledger for their costs and the charges. And this is the launch of the very last ferry boat, the Eunice, which was launched in September 1921. It had an engine and could carry 6 cars, and it remained in use until the ferry service ended in 1936. The excitement of launch day is visible here. You can see the crowds that were assembled. This is a 1927 photograph from the Nelson collection. And this lists the ferry charges. I'll let you look at that briefly for a moment. Many factors combined to bring about the end of the Cobequid Bay ferries. The coming of the railway across the Shubenacadie River in 1901 had an immediate effect. The improvement in road conditions and a dramatic increase in automobile traffic meant the drive to Shubenacadie to cross the river was less of an inconvenience than waiting for the conditions of the tide to be just right for a crossing. Here we see vehicles at Black Rock. I don't know anything that could be more delightful than to see my old friend, the late Jerry Hilchey, as a 2-year-old in the back seat of this 1928 photo as her family prepares to cross. These both pictures were taken on July 2nd, 1928, as they crossed the river to visit her grandmother's house. More photos of the Eunice at work. This undated photo shows Cochrane's Wharf with the Eunice docking, and here is a schedule, and the flagpole at the end shows the barrel that was used to signal when a crossing was going to happen. Cochrane's Wharf again, with the hustle and bustle. And Cochrane's Wharf under flood conditions. This is a current map showing an assortment of other Nova Scotia ferries that are still in operation. And we'll have some photographs next of the, on the top left, an agricultural ferry in Digby County. Top right, a 1920s photo of the Englishtown ferry in Cape Breton. Bottom left, I'm not sure what that location is, but it shows an automobile on a ferry. And the bottom right, an undated picture of the Briar Island Ferry.